person, you have the option to buy it from the guy in the street for 10, or to come into one of our stores, which are incredibly clean, air-conditioned in the hot cities, very hygienic, much better cup of tea, with clean water for a few extra, for a small percentage extra. Okay, I want to go back to the conceptual idea behind Chai Point. Because in a sense, what we were doing was exactly what I was telling my students. Figure out what are the problems. Why is it that the fellow who's selling the cup of tea for 10 taka is forced to give you something that is relatively low quality, that isn't particularly clean, and is limited in the obvious ways that it is. Right? So there are lots of so-called institutional inadequacies that he is constrained by. One, there are no reliable food quality and safety standards. I put the example there of Consumer Reports, which is a very famous credibility enhancer, a ratifier of quality in the US. It may not mean anything to you, so I would just ignore it. But the idea is that there isn't a regulator out there who's ensuring that if somebody gives you contaminated water in the tea, that he will be held to account. There's nobody out there who's policing that. And even if there is a rule, there's no enforcement in a country like yours or mine. So what have we done? We've had to compensate for that by building a reputation and making it so that our neck is really out of the line if we do something like that. And to develop equipment and protocols for sanitary behavior to reassure the customer base that we will use only the highest quality of ingredients and ensure that this doesn't happen. Talent sourcing is a big problem. You can never find enough trained manpower to staff a store like this. And that's extremely true in your country for sure. And it's very true in my country. It's true in every developing country I've been to. So we've had to create an entire people's supply chain by working through partnerships with NGOs, through people who've retired from the armed forces, through religious organizations. We've built partnerships with them to get reliable people that we could put through little training programs. We've had to create housing solutions. So I imagine that Dhaka is like Bangalore or Delhi or Mumbai, which is if you come from the village to Dhaka, it's very hard to find a place to stay. So we've had to solve that problem because people coming in don't have a place to stay. So if we can address the housing situation, we get a workforce that's less likely to quit. And that means we can afford to spend more time training them because they aren't going to take on training and leave and go somewhere else. We've had to create financial solutions for lower income consumers. Even though we're talking about 10 taka or 15 taka, that still matters to many people. And if you want to have 2 cups of tea a day, that's a lot of money to some people. So we've had to create ways to do that. And we've had to do our own market research for this particular segment and use the data from our prepaid cards and other ways of paying for it to begin to understand the buying patterns, who's coming 1, twice, 3 times, 4 times a week or day, whatever. So the point I'm trying to make is that even though the core business is no different than the guy on the street selling a 10 taka cup of tea, we've had to compensate for all these institutional inadequacies to make the business actually work in a state-of-the-art, world-class way, and to build it on a platform that I can confidently say, scale to 1,000 stores without a problem. So I see opportunity where there seems to be adversity, and I think that's a little bit of the mindset that I encourage as many of us to adopt as we can. Let me see, I'm sort of a little bit out of time, so let me just make one more point. This, one of the problems I'm working on is that comes a little bit out of this Chai Point experience, supply chain, so that all food that shows up in its metro stores can be traced all the way back to the farm from which it came from. Again, super expensive, right? Great idea, super expensive, probably will work at some point, but it's going to take a while. Yeah? The one on the right is a solution is a social solution in India that's been operating for a long time. Amul is probably the world's biggest dairy, and it's a dairy cooperative in Gujarat, the Gujarat state of India. And this is not a technological solution. It's more like your microfinance solution where you use social pressure and peer pressure to make sure that people are doing the right thing. And in a sense, it's addressed the quality problem in no small measure in India. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the Chai Point experiment that's underway between my students and myself in Bangalore is one stab at one kind of issue about not so good food products. But if you look at the general problem of inadequacy of food quality and food safety, you see that everywhere. And to me, again, those represent opportunities that people are willing to pay for. Coming back to the Chinese milk, no Chinese student who comes to the US today goes back home without taking suitcases full of milk powder. It just doesn't happen. In fact, David Cameron's government in the UK put a blanket ban on people exporting milk powder from the UK because the UK shelves had been emptied of milk powder last year. My daughter, son, and wife and I lived in Shanghai last year for several weeks, and a lot of my students in China who were very wealthy were importing milk from Tokyo and Hong Kong. So this is a problem. The point I'm trying to make is that people are willing to pay good money to see a solution that can be developed. And it's a well-defined problem, therefore I believe it's a solvable problem. And it just requires some ingenuity to go to it. And these are some of the things that people are going after, those who wish to do so. But those just don't work. What really works is a lot of people addressing a small piece of it and being clever about how it fits into other pieces that other people are doing. And then sharing with generosity what has been done so that other people can free ride on the efforts. That's how I believe entrepreneurial ecosystems develop. So let me stop with that. I promised you 2 stories. I gave you 2.5. One about talent assessment, one about 10 taka tea to be improved, and a half story about Chinese milk. Shall we, how would you like to conduct?
Yeah, we can start taking questions now.
Okay, so perhaps I can.
Anyone with questions, kindly raise your hands. We have volunteers who will take the cordless mic to you.
Thank you, sir. It was a nice presentation, I think.
Please identify yourself and.
I am Qazi Mohammad Ahmed. I am from BRAC University School of Law. My question is, when you said that when you start something and you see some missing points towards your way, and then what if I right? And I see some missing links, how should go to the at the last point, or I should start from that and try to link those things?
Do you understand? Okay, can you repeat it once more? Use that one.
My question was that when you start a company and you see the missing links, so what you have to do? First, put effort to those missing links, or you start a company or try to rely on people or government to solve those things, because it's not the way I think.
I think the way you entered your question, I think suggests the answer, which I would espouse. I think if you wait for the government to solve these problems, you'll be waiting forever. So that's not a viable solution. The clever way to do it is to find something that, first of all, you should be excited about the problem that you want to solve, because it's, I'm presenting a couple of examples as reasonably successful efforts so far. Still young, still a few years old, but reasonably successful. But they mask dozens of failures. So you should expect to fail many times. And so you better be enjoying what you're working on. But in all those cases, I would prefer to find other people to partner with to collectively address the problem rather than wait for anybody else, because the waiting is a fool's errand, I think.
Manager Learning and Development, and it's been a real pleasure to hear some of the very interesting issues that is being going on around the world about the milk powder issue, and then the students carrying over milk powder from US and UK to Shanghai. Very interesting. So my point is, since we have talked about the industrial words, if I can remember properly, so where do you find some of the leakage, then you work out with getting some of the solution to that. And you talked about the chai point, so the people can have chai without having any contaminated issue. So since you talked about this milk thing, I mean China, so isn't there anybody in China who can come up with some ideas so that they can get rid of these kind of things? Because that is also an industrial void in their industry, that people are having no faith on their country who can actually provide milk powder, because it is such a tender issue for such a country, because without milk powder you can't nurture your nation. I'm talking about China. So is there any planning from your aspiring mind to get some solution for the Chinese government so that they can come up with some solution? Because I think it's a real life situation. Thank you very much.
Let me comment on the and I think the reason it's a tough problem is that from the time that you get, so to speak, raw milk, unpasteurized milk from a cow typically, until the time that the milk is fed to a child, especially, it's touched by literally a dozen to 2 dozen intermediaries, including transportation companies, pasteurization firms, agents who collect the milk, agents who disperse it, packaging guys, branding people, etc. In China, each of these are in different provinces, and each of the provinces in the different cities have different jurisdictions and governments and different incentives. So there are literally, I don't know, 100 different actors with different incentives that are acting on this bottle of milk. And it has proven extremely hard so far for any simple-minded solution to address this. For instance, simply issuing a new law that says you can't do this, even with extreme consequences that we don't normally find, at least in South Asia. In other words, if you were contaminating milk, it's very unlikely that you'd be shot. But in China, the senior most people have been shot for some of these crimes that have been committed. But even that has not worked as a deterrent. So, you know, there are lots of people, some Chinese and some foreign companies, that are busy trying to fill this particular void of lack of guarantor of quality. But it's not always so easy to pull off. And I think that's the reality of economic development and economic change. So some clever but unscrupulous person figured out that poisoning milk and diluting it is profitable. And indeed it is in the short run. With the unfortunate consequence of damaging the health of people who consume it. But now cleverer people have to find some way to outcompete the unscrupulous clever person. And that's the game of intellectual chess that's going on right now with it. So that's what I would say.
Way back in, I think in '97, you wrote that focus strategies are not appropriate for emerging economies and conglomerates rule. So 15 years down the line, what do you think? Things have changed, or it's still the same? Because when you said that you're thinking of opening 1,000 branches of Chai Point, it's like it's really easy to scale up in India, but it's not that easy. So what makes you so optimistic? Did the ecosystem change? Is it conducive to entrepreneurs now?
So there are a lot of questions there. Let me address the back end of it. Has the ecosystem changed in a developing country like India? So, India is in some ways a little bit ahead of Bangladesh. In some ways, it's pretty far behind, particularly on the health and education indicators and so on. But what has changed very positively in the last 15 or 20 years is the creation of a vibrant system for the sort of entrepreneurship that I'm talking about. By no means across the country, because the country is big and complicated. But certainly there are 4 or 5 pockets, cities, city clusters. So I would say around Pune, the city of Pune, near Mumbai, not Mumbai proper, but Pune. Mumbai is too expensive to be good for entrepreneurs. Pune, Bangalore, the national capital region, some parts of Hyderabad. These 4 or 5 regions, there are pockets where the sort of supporting structures that you need to be an entrepreneur are much more in evidence today than they were before. And so as one of my students who wants to build a business, they naturally gravitate to these places where the so-called voids or inadequacies are much less costly to them. So in a sense, it's a lot easier than it used to be, but I wouldn't characterize it as easy. Even the Chai Point solution that I'm so flippantly describing as we've solved it is very, very tricky. There's a whole host of problems that you would expect, ranging from corruption and mafia-like thugs who show up and try to beat you down, and then you have to decide. It's really a moment of truth as to what you do with it. We choose to shut down instead of making money. So we close the store and we walk away. And that's really worked to build a reputation that it's not worth harassing these guys. But there are things like that. There's just simple mistakes we make every day. We open stores and they turn out to be very unprofitable. And then the one skill that we're trying to develop is to shut them down quickly. And it's tough because you don't know when to close them. So I didn't mean to imply that it was very easy. But it's certainly a lot easier than it was 15, 20 years ago because there is support. And the biggest support is that there are lots of people trying to do things like this. So there's a community and a peer group, and particularly young people. And myself sitting in Boston, what I try to do for my students is to say, I will try to be a support net for you. So if you try it for a couple of years and it fails, I'll try to find you a job. So it's not it's not foolproof, but it's a good net. That's my way of trying to help.
Thank you.
In our business school, we have one American faculty member. Actually, he has been living here for last 30 years. He tried this idea of tea point, chai point, and he brought inside this class these tea suppliers with flask and all those things, and chal muri, fried rice with chilies and all.
Yeah.
We also brought in, he also brought in some bankers in his class also to really mess these ideas for the last 2 years. But I guess the constraint in Dhaka is getting at some fixed places. It's very expensive to get any place in Dhaka to do something of that nature and then really increase the size of the business. So what we are now, we are seeing that this moving business actually, that these markets corners or the Chalmeri or the Pushkar shops, all these things, they are doing good business, and that's the way I think it will continue for some time in Dhaka. And we bring this, we try to organize with our students, but so far we failed actually. Perhaps the cost of any space and also getting some supplies like water and electricity is exorbitant here actually. That's my experience for the last 2 years that I've seen.
The state particularly in New Delhi is much higher than Dhaka, much higher than Dhaka. But the solution to that is to find pockets where that's not the case. So you go to the outer suburbs and you try to build a reputation by doing it in places where real estate is a little bit less expensive. And what we found is that, so one reason why we've stayed away from Mumbai is exactly that, is that it's too expensive to try in Mumbai. But we've tried in other places. And once we've built a reputation by doing a few stores, we've been able to go into corporate campuses and go to corporates and say, why don't you open 10 stores in your different corporate campuses? And that's worked out. Over time, we've sort of learned different tricks to get around this. We've formed different formats of stores. And I think the push format is great. It's a great format. We've rejected that format because you simply can't put in some of the equipment that you need to have very high quality stuff in a pushcart format at a cost-effective point. At least we haven't been able to figure out how to do that. I take your point. It's a fair, it's a different business model. Yeah.
So I mean, very learned people who've been talking, and I'm just an entrepreneur. So my questions are more basic. First question was, as entrepreneurs, we find that the fundamental void that we have is not money, it's really the people, the skilled people. So how can we get into your matching program in Bangladesh? This is one. Let me also finish my second question so that you can. The second question is something that came to my mind while I was actually waiting over here and discussing with my learned professors. What is your idea in countries such as Bangladesh, and maybe in India, maybe slightly different, do the business schools, do they lag or do they lead the business environment? Do they understand what is required, or are they leading Are they behind or the leading, or are they out of whack, completely? Thank you.
These are both excellent questions. So let's go in the order that you raised them. The first one. So I think that. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think the fundamental problem that we need to solve, as all of us, societies that are trying to develop and move out of poverty, is the problem of talent allocation. Talent nurturing, but talent nurturing happens, people invest in their own upgrading of talent if they think that there is some reward at the end of the line. And the reward has to be that they find a meaningful occupation of some sort that has some degree of at least minimal compensation, but more important, some psychic satisfaction. And we just don't pay attention to that. At best, what we have is one or two universities that are good in each of these countries. And they may be cycled through a few hundreds or a few thousand people, but the vast millions get left behind. And therefore we get exactly what we see when you look out the window, which is nonsense all over in all these cities, including this one. So the talent allocation problem is paramount. So we, Aspiring Minds was set up just exactly as I described, as an algorithm literally on a napkin, that began to work in a small way. Now we found that entrepreneurs like yourself in the Philippines, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Russia, in Germany, in the US have licensed our technologies and are building their own systems off it. And so we've been adapting with different people and finding ways to get into it. But perhaps more systemically, there's a very interesting experiment that some enterprising bureaucrat in India started called the National Skill Development Council, NSDC, which somehow, despite the staggering inefficiency of the Indian government, somehow the government decided to capitalize, and thank goodness for that. And so what has happened in the last 2 years is there are these 30 or 40 so-called sector skill councils that have come up at the initiative of the government of India. So for instance, everybody in automotive comes together.